The snow fell on the fifth day. 16 people huddled in my two small cabins, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, their eyes fixed on me. And the man who had sworn to take everything I own, the man who had tried to destroy me, now knelt at my doorstep, his lips blue, his body shaking, begging to be let inside. I was 14 years old, and I had to decide whether to save the life of my enemy. But to understand why I stood there with that impossible choice before me, you need to know how it all began. You need to know about the bridge, the cat, the grandmother who believed in me, and the dream that everyone said was impossible. Let me take you back 5 months to the summer of 1893, when my world ended and began again on the same day. Part 1. The Seed of an Impossible Dream. I remember the taste of that morning. Chamomile tea, slightly bitter because I had let it steep too long. Honey from our own hives, thick and golden. The last breakfast I would ever share with my grandmother. Her name was Astrid Lindgren, and she had raised me since I was 3 years old, since the day my parents died on a mountain road in a storm that came without warning. She was 72 that summer, her hair white as the snow that would later change everything, her hands gnarled from decades of work on our Montana homestead. But her eyes, those eyes were still sharp as winter stars. She was coughing that morning. She had been coughing for months, each day a little worse than the last. The doctor from town had come twice, shaken his head twice, and charged us money we could barely spare both times. Consumption, he called it. The wasting disease. There was nothing to be done. My name is Sina Lindgren. I was 14 years old, and I was about to become an orphan for the second time in my life. Cold Valley, Montana, was not a place for the faint of heart. It sat at the bottom of a deep gouge in the mountains, a valley so shaped that it trapped cold air like water in a bowl. Winter temperatures could drop so low that thermometers stopped working. People froze to death walking between their barn and their house, a distance of 30 feet. Sensible people did not settle in Cold Valley. My family had never been sensible. My great-grandfather had been the first to come, arriving in 1865 with nothing but Swedish stubbornness and an absolute refusal to admit defeat. He cleared the land, built the cabin, raised children, and died at 83, having never spent a single winter anywhere else. My grandfather continued what his father started, and my grandmother, after burying her husband and then her only daughter, my mother, kept the homestead alive through sheer force of will. Now she was dying, and I would be alone. That morning, as we sat at the small wooden table that my great-grandfather had built, she reached across and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. They were always cold now. Sina, she said, her voice rasping from the cough that never stopped. There is something I need to show you. Something I should have shown you years ago. She led me to her bedroom, to the old trunk at the foot of her bed. I had seen that trunk 1,000 times, had been told 1,000 times never to open it. It held memories, she always said. Memories that hurt too much to look at. Now she lifted the lid. Inside, beneath layers of old letters and faded photographs, was a leather notebook. The binding was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. On the cover, in handwriting I did not recognize, was a name, Eric Lindgren, my grandfather. Open it, my grandmother whispered. I did. The pages were filled with drawings, technical drawings, precise and detailed, showing structures I had never seen before. 2 buildings connected by an elevated walkway, a covered passage with a peaked roof, notes in Swedish and English, calculations, measurements, plans. What is this? I asked. Your grandfather's dream, she said, and she began to cough again, a terrible sound that seemed to tear something loose inside her. When she could speak again, her voice was barely a whisper. He wanted to build a way to move between buildings without going outside, so no one would ever freeze to death walking from house to barn, so no one would ever die the way his own father almost died, caught in a blizzard just steps from his own door. I stared at the drawings. They were beautiful in their precision, elegant in their simplicity. Why did he never build it? I asked. She smiled, but it was a bitter smile full of old grief. No money, no time, no one who believed it would work. She paused, gathering strength, but he never stopped believing, and neither did I. I looked at my grandmother, at the woman who had raised me, loved me, taught me everything I knew about surviving in this harsh land. Do you think it could work? I asked. She squeezed my hand, and for a moment, her grip was strong, the grip of the woman she had been before the sickness took hold. I think, she said, that you are the one who will finish what he started. That night, after she had gone to sleep, I sat by lamplight and studied my grandfather's drawings until my eyes burned. I traced every line with my fingertip. I read every note, sounding out the Swedish words I did not know. And somewhere in those quiet hours, a seed took root in my heart, a seed that would grow into something no one expected. 3 weeks later, I stood at her grave. July rain fell on the fresh-turned earth, mixing with my tears until I could not tell them apart. The whole valley came to the funeral, all 47 people who lived within 10 miles of our homestead. They brought food I could not eat, and words I could not hear, and sympathy I did not want. They also brought opinions. Opal Hendricks, who ran the boarding house in town, was the first to speak. "Poor child," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. 14 years old and all alone. What will become of her? Gunnar Eriksson, our nearest neighbor, answered before I could. She will sell the land and go east, to relatives. There is nothing for her here. I looked at Gunnar. He was 45 years old, weathered by decades of cold valley winters. His wife, Maren, had died 3 years ago in a sudden blizzard. I had heard the story many times. She had gone to check on the animals, just 30 feet from their door, and never made it back. Gunnar found her the next morning frozen, her hand reaching toward home. He had 4 children and eyes that had not smiled since. I could have corrected him. I could have told him that I had no relatives in the East, that my grandmother had been my only family, that I had nowhere else to go and nowhere I wanted to be except right here. Instead, I said nothing, but I did not miss the way Silas Thornton looked at me from across the cemetery. His gaze was calculating, measuring as if he were appraising livestock at auction. Silas Thornton was the richest man in Coal Valley. He owned the largest ranch, employed the most workers, and controlled the water rights to half the valley. He was 50 years old, with a face like carved granite and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. Those eyes were calculating me now, or rather, they were calculating my land. My 80 acres sat along Willow Creek, the only year-round water source in this part of the valley. The creek fed both my homestead and his ranch, and for years he had wanted complete control of that water. For years, my grandmother had refused to sell. Now she was gone, and I was 14 years old, an orphan girl with no one to protect me. After the funeral, as the last of the mourners were leaving, Silas approached me. His boots squelched in the mud as he walked, and when he stopped before me, I had to crane my neck to meet his eyes. "Miss Lindgren," he said, and his voice was smooth as oil on water. "I am so sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Stubborn as a mule, but remarkable." I said nothing. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "I know this is not the time to discuss business matters," he continued, "but when you are ready, I would like to make you an offer for your property. A generous offer, double what the land is worth. Enough for you to start a new life somewhere more suitable for a young woman alone. This land belonged to my great-grandfather," I said. "My grandfather worked it. My grandmother kept it alive for 60 years. It is mine now, and I am not selling." His smile flickered just for a moment, and I saw something cold beneath it, something dangerous. "You are young," he said. "You will change your mind when winter comes. This valley is no place for a child playing at being a farmer. The cold does not care about stubbornness or sentiment. Then I will die on my own land," I said. His eyes narrowed. "That," he said quietly, "can be arranged." He walked away, leaving me standing among the gravestones with rain running down my face and fear running down my spine. That night, I sat at my grandmother's table, now my table, and opened my grandfather's notebook. Queenie jumped onto my lap, her warm weight a comfort against the cold that seemed to seep through the cabin walls even in July. Queenie was my grandmother's cat, a calico with golden eyes and an opinion about everything. She was 5 years old, still young and agile, but already wise beyond her years. My grandmother always said that Queenie had chosen her, had appeared at the door one winter day as a half-frozen kitten, and simply refused to leave. Now Queenie had chosen me. I stroked her fur and studied the drawings. The more I looked at them, the more I understood what my grandfather had envisioned. Two cabins connected by an elevated walkway, protected from snow and wind. A way to move between buildings without ever stepping into the killing cold. On the last page of the notebook, in handwriting that shook with age or illness, my grandfather had written a final note. I will not live to build this, but someone will. Someone who believes that winter is not a death sentence. Someone who refuses to accept that we must risk our lives every time we step outside our doors. If you are reading this, you are that someone. Build it, prove them wrong, and never let the cold win. I closed the notebook and looked at Queenie. I am going to do it, I told her. I am going to build grandfather's passage. She purred as if she had known all along. I announced my plan the next week. Gunnar Eriksson was the first to hear it. He had come to check on me, bringing a basket of eggs and a jar of preserved vegetables from his garden. His daughter Britta was with him, a girl of 13 with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. I'm going to build a second cabin, I told them as we sat at my kitchen table. A workshop for storage and work during winter. And I am going to connect it to this cabin with a covered passage, like a bridge, elevated above the snow, with a roof to shed the drifts. When winter comes, I will be able to move between buildings without ever stepping outside. Gunnar stared at me as if I had announced I was going to fly to the moon. Britta stared at me with something like wonder. Queenie, sitting on the windowsill, purred as if she already knew this was going to work. You are a girl, Gunnar said finally, his voice heavy with disbelief. A child. You cannot build a cabin by yourself, let alone some kind of suspended bridge between buildings. It is not suspended, I said, opening my grandfather's notebook and spreading the drawings across the table. It will be on posts, elevated 3 feet off the ground, above the worst snowdrifts. The roof will be peaked at 45 degrees to shed snow. The walls will have gaps between the boards, like louvers to let air circulate but block the wind and most of the snow. He studied the drawings for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Your grandfather designed this, he asked. Yes, he was an engineer in Sweden before he came to America. He calculated everything, the loads, the angles, the stress points. He just never had the chance to build it. Gunnar shook his head slowly. Even if this could work, he said, you cannot build it alone. You are one girl. This would take a crew of men weeks to complete. I have all summer and fall, I said, and I am stronger than I look. You will fail, he said, not unkindly but with absolute certainty. The first storm will destroy it. I have lived in this valley for 20 years, and I have never seen anything like this survive a real winter. Then you have never seen me try, he said. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Sell your land, Sina, he said. Go somewhere safe. There is nothing for you here but cold and death. He walked out, but Britta lingered at the door, her eyes bright with something I could not name. I believe you, she whispered, and then she was gone. Word spread through Cold Valley like wildfire. The Lindgren girl has gone crazy, Opal Hendricks announced at her boarding house, to anyone who would listen. She thinks she can build 2 cabins connected by a bridge. The grief has addled her brain. It is not a bridge, someone corrected her. It is a passage, like those covered bridges back east. Covered bridges are for crossing water, not for surviving snow, Opal snorted. The girl does not know what she is doing. Someone should put a stop to it before she hurts herself. But the one who spread the most poison was Silas Thornton. The orphan is clearly not capable of managing her property, he said at a town meeting in August, his voice dripping with false concern. She is wasting resources on a foolish project that will fail. Perhaps the courts should appoint a guardian to manage her affairs until she comes of age. For her own protection, of course. I was there. I heard every word. I stood up, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I am perfectly capable of managing my own property, I said. My grandmother managed it for decades, and she taught me everything she knew. I know what I am doing. You are 14 years old, Silas said, his voice smooth and reasonable and utterly condescending. You are building something that cannot possibly work. When winter comes and you are frozen in your cabin with no food and no firewood, who will help you then? Will your pride keep you warm? My passage will keep me warm, I said, And when it works, when I walk from my cabin to my workshop without stepping outside while the blizzard rages, you will owe me an apology." He smiled, that cold smile I was learning to hate. "If it works," he said, "I will apologize. I will get down on my knees and beg your forgiveness. But it will not work. Nothing you build will survive a real Cold Valley winter. And when you finally admit defeat, I will be here, ready to take that land off your hands for a fair price." He paused. "Think about my offer, Miss Lindgren, for it is too late." I walked out of that meeting with my head high and my hands shaking and my heart full of a fury I had never felt before. That night, I cried for the first time since my grandmother died. I cried until my eyes burned and my chest ached, and there were no tears left. Queenie climbed into my bed and pressed her warm body against mine, purring and purring until I finally fell asleep. That night, Britta came to visit me in secret. She brought news that made my blood run cold. "My father told me something," she whispered, her face pale in the lamplight. "About Silas Thornton, about why he hates your family so much." I leaned forward. "Tell me, 20 years ago, before you were born, Silas asked your mother to marry him. She refused. She chose your father instead, a poor farmer with nothing but dreams." Britta paused, her voice dropping even lower. "My father says Silas never forgave her. He swore he would take everything your family had. He has been waiting all these years, watching, planning." I felt the pieces click into place. The constant offers to buy our land, the hatred in his eyes when he looked at me, the threats that felt too personal to be just about water rights. "There is more," Britta said, her voice barely audible. "My father heard a rumor, years ago, about the accident that killed your parents. Some people say Silas was on that road the same day. Some people say he saw what happened." My heart stopped beating. "What are you saying?" "I do not know if it is true," Britta said quickly. "It is just a rumor. Nobody can prove anything. But Sina, be careful. This is not just about land or water rights. This is personal. He wants to destroy your family completely. He wants to erase every trace of the woman who rejected him." I sat in the darkness long after Britta left, Queenie warm in my lap, my mind racing with terrible possibilities. If Silas Thornton had something to do with my parents' death, I would find out. But first I had a passage to build, and I would build it stronger, better, more permanent than anything he could tear down. If you have made it this far in my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to face the world alone? Have you ever had a dream that everyone told you was impossible? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought was just an obstacle was actually an enemy with a much darker purpose? Leave me a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And now let me tell you what happened when Silas Thornton decided that mocking me was not enough. I started building in early September when the summer heat finally broke and the first cool winds came down from the mountains. The mornings were crisp now, the kind of cold that woke you up and made you feel alive. I would stand outside my cabin at dawn, watching my breath form clouds in the air, and I would look at the empty space where my passage would be. In my mind, I could already see it, the posts rising from the ground, the walkway stretching between cabin and workshop, the roof that would shed snow like water off a duck's back. But there was so much work to do before that vision became reality. The work was harder than I had imagined, much harder. Each support post had to be cut from lodgepole pine, the straightest trees I could find on my own land. I spent days walking through my forest, examining trunks, rejecting any that had too much curve or too many knots. When I found a good one, I would mark it with a strip of cloth and move on. I needed 8 perfect trees, and I would not settle for anything less. Then came the cutting. I had my grandmother's cross-cut saw, a 2-person tool that I had to use alone. I would brace the blade against the trunk, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, each stroke biting a little deeper into the wood. My arms burned, my back screamed. Sweat dripped into my eyes even in the cool morning air. But I did not stop. Each post had to be stripped of bark, trimmed to the right length, and sunk 4 feet into the ground to protect against frost heaving. Each one weighed nearly as much as I did. I built a system of ropes and pulleys to lift them into place, using techniques my grandmother had taught me for moving heavy objects around the farm. The first post took me an entire day to set, By the time I had it upright and packed with stones and dirt to hold it steady, my hands were bleeding and my back felt like it was on fire. 7 more to go, but I did not stop. Day after day, I worked from first light until I could no longer see. I dug holes until my arms ached. I lifted posts until my shoulders screamed. I measured and calculated and adjusted, checking every angle against my grandfather's drawings, making sure everything was perfect. Because it had to be perfect. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the whole structure would fail. And Silas Thornton would be there, waiting to say I told you so. I would not give him that satisfaction. Queenie supervised from various perches around the construction site. She would sit on the porch railing or the top of a fence post or the roof of the main cabin, watching everything I did with her golden eyes. Sometimes she would walk along a completed section of framing, testing its sturdiness with her weight. If the boards held, she would meow once, a short sound of approval. If they wobbled, she would hiss and jump down, and I would know I needed to reinforce that section. She was the best foreman I could have asked for. Britta came when she could, sneaking away from her chores to help. She was not strong enough to lift the heavy posts, but she could hold boards in place while I hammered. She could carry water from the well when I was too tired to walk that far. She could sit with me in the evenings and keep me company when the loneliness threatened to swallow me whole. "You are the only one who believes me," I told her one afternoon as we sat on the half-finished passage floor, eating apples from my grandmother's orchard. She shook her head. "No," she said, "Queenie believes you too." I looked at the cat who was grooming herself in a patch of late afternoon sunlight. "Queenie is a cat," I said. "She does not count." Britta smiled, a sad smile that made her look older than her 13 years. "Cats count more than people sometimes," she said. "People lie. They tell you what they think you want to hear, or what makes them look good, or what helps them get what they want. Cats never do that. Cats just tell the truth." I could not argue with that. On the morning of October 3rd, I woke to find 2 of my support posts knocked down. The ropes that held them upright while the dirt settled had been cut clean through, not frayed from weather or wear, cut. With a knife sharp and deliberate, I stood in the early morning light, staring at the destruction, and felt something crack inside me. 3 weeks of work, 3 weeks of sweat and blood and aching muscles and sleepless nights. Gone in a single act of cruelty. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Queenie came to stand beside me. She looked at the fallen posts, then looked up at me, and made a sound I had never heard from her before. It was not quite a meow, not quite a growl. It was something in between, something that sounded almost like a question. Who did this? I looked at the ground around the posts, searching for clues, and there, in the soft dirt, were hoof prints. Fresh hoof prints leading east, toward the Thornton Ranch. I had no proof. I could not go to the sheriff and accuse the richest man in the Valley of sabotage based on hoof prints that could have come from any horse. No one would believe me. No one would even investigate. But I knew Silas Thornton had done this. He had sent someone in the night to destroy my work, to break my spirit, to make me give up and sell him and my land. I knelt in the dirt, my whole body trembling, with a rage so intense it frightened me. Queenie rubbed against my legs, purring loudly, trying to comfort me in the only way she knew. And then I stood up. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and looked at the damage. 2 posts down, 2 posts that would have to be set again. Days of work that would have to be repeated, but not undone. "I will not let him win," I said to Queenie, to the mountains, to the ghost of my grandmother. "I will build it again. I will build it stronger, and I will finish it before winter comes." I picked up my shovel and started digging new holes. Deeper this time, wider, strong enough to withstand anything. Britta found me that evening, still working by lamplight, my hands raw and bleeding, my back screaming with every movement. She did not say anything at first. She just looked at the fallen posts, at the cut ropes, at the new holes I was digging. "Thornton," she whispered, and her voice was thick with the same anger I felt. "Probably," I said, "but I cannot prove it." She was quiet for a moment, her jaw tight, her hands clenched into fists. Then she knelt down beside me and picked up a shovel. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Helping," she said. "My father will be angry. He told me to stay away from your project, but I do not care anymore. I am tired of watching good people suffer while bad people win. We worked together until the moon rose high over the mountains like begins, digging holes for new posts, setting the foundations for a dream that everyone said was impossible. When Britta finally went home, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. You are going to do this, she said. I know you are. And I am going to be there when you prove them all wrong. 3 days later, Gunnar Eriksson came to my door. I was covered in dirt and sawdust, my clothes torn, my hair tangled, my hands wrapped in rags to protect the blisters that covered every finger. I expected him to yell at me for corrupting his daughter. I expected him to tell me again to sell the land and leave. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Britta told me what happened, he said quietly, about the posts, about who she thinks did it. I said nothing. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling beneath his faded work shirt. For 3 years, I have told myself that nothing could have saved my wife, that the storm was too sudden, too fierce, that no one could have stopped what happened. He paused, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. But if there had been a passage, he said slowly, each word heavy with meaning, like the one you are building. If Maren could have walked from the barn to the house without going outside, without having to navigate through the storm, his voice broke. She would still be alive, he finished. I did not know what to say, so I reached out and took his hand, the way my grandmother used to do when words were not enough. He looked at the frame of my passage, at the posts rising from the ground, at the half-finished walkway that represented everything I believed in. I do not know if this will work, he said finally. I am not an engineer. I do not understand the calculations, but I do know that you should not have to do this alone. He picked up a hammer from my toolbox. Show me what to do, he said. With Gunnar's help, the work went faster. He was a skilled carpenter, far better than I would ever be. He strengthened the joints I had made, corrected the angles I had gotten wrong, taught me techniques that my grandfather's notebook had never mentioned. He showed me how to notch logs so they fit together perfectly, how to brace structures against the wind, how to calculate loads in ways my grandfather had not known. And he brought resources I could not afford. Lumber from his own stockpile, tools I did not have, nails by the hundreds. Why are you doing this? I asked him one evening as we sat on the finished floor of the passage, watching the sun set over the mountains. He was quiet for a long time, watching the light fade from gold to orange to red. Because I spent 3 years blaming God for my wife's death, he said at last. Blaming the weather, blaming the valley, blaming everything except myself for not building something that might have saved her. He looked at me, and now a 14-year-old girl is doing what I should have done years ago, building something that could save lives. I am not going to stand by and watch you fail just because I was too much of a coward to try. I reached out and squeezed his hand. We will finish it together, I said, and then we will build one for you too, between your house and your barn, so your children never have to be afraid of the walk from one to the other. He smiled, the first real smile I had seen from him since we met. You sound like your grandmother, he said. She always believed in impossible things too. I took that as the highest compliment he could give. By the first week of November, the passage was complete. I remember the moment I drove in the last nail. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The air smelled like pine and sawdust and the promise of snow. My hands were calloused and scarred. My muscles ached from weeks of constant labor. But my heart was so full I thought it might burst. I stepped back and looked at what we had built. It stretched 30 feet from my main cabins to the new workshop, an elevated walkway with a peaked roof and slatted walls. The floor sat 3 feet above the ground, high enough to stay clear of the deepest snowdrifts. The roof sloped at 45 degrees, steep enough to shed snow before it could pile up. The walls had gaps between the overlapping boards like louvers, allowing air to circulate while blocking most of the wind and snow. It was not beautiful, not in the way a painting or a sunset is beautiful. The wood was rough, the joints were visible. The whole thing looked like something a child might build from scraps and stubbornness, which I suppose it was. But to me, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I walked through it for the first time on a cold November morning, with Queenie trotting beside me. I could hear the boards creak under my weight, could feel the solid construction beneath my feet, could see my breath forming clouds in the cold air. The walls blocked the wind, the roof kept out the sky, the floor was solid beneath my feet. It worked. Gunnar walked through it next, then Britta, then her three younger siblings, who treated it like the greatest adventure of their lives. It is like a tunnel, the youngest one said, his eyes wide with wonder. A magic tunnel through the cold. It is not magic, I told him. It is engineering. But I was smiling when I said it. Word spread through the valley like wildfire. The Lindgren girl finished her project. People whispered at the feed store, in the boarding house, and the church on Sunday. She actually built it. That crazy double cabin with the covered passage between. Some came to see for themselves. Most of them left impressed, though few would admit it out loud. Silas Thornton came too. He walked through my passage slowly, deliberately, running his hand along the walls, studying the joints in the roof line, with eyes that missed nothing. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone that revealed nothing of his thoughts. When he emerged, he stood for a long moment, looking at the structure I had built. "It is clever," he said at last, "for a child." "It is more than clever," I said. "It will save lives." His smile was thin as a blade. "One small storm proves nothing," he said. "Wait until a real blizzard comes, the kind that kills cattle in their barns and freezes men solid between heartbeats. Then we will see what your little bridge is worth." "It is not a bridge," I said. "It is a passage." He shrugged, already turning to leave. "Call it what you like. It will not survive the winter." He walked away, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. I watched him go, feeling the hatred coil in my stomach like a living thing, but also feeling something else. Certainty. He was wrong, and soon everyone would know it. The first real test came in the middle of November. A storm rolled in overnight without warning, dropping 18 inches of snow and bringing winds that howled like wolves hunting in the darkness. When I woke, the world outside my window was white, a curtain of snow so thick I could not see 3 feet beyond the glass. But the passage held. I walked from my cabin to my workshop without feeling a single snowflake. The elevated floor was clear, rising above the drifts that buried everything at ground level. The peaked roof had shed its snow perfectly, leaving only a light dusting on the boards. The slatted walls transformed the screaming wind into a gentle breeze. I stood in the middle of my passage, surrounded by chaos, untouched by it. The storm raged on all sides, but inside my creation, there was peace, and I laughed. I laughed until Queenie came to see what was wrong, picking her way carefully along the passage floor, her fur fluffed against the cold. I scooped her up and danced with her, spinning in circles while the blizzard raged outside. "We did it," I told her. "We did it, Queenie. It works. It really works." She purred and butted her head against my chin. "Of course it works," she seemed to say. "Did you ever really doubt it?" If you are still with me, still listening to this story, I want you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened next changed everything, and you are not going to want to miss it. Do you think my passage survived the winter? Do you think Silas Thornton finally admitted he was wrong? Let me know in the comments what you think will happen. And now let me tell you about Britta, about Queenie, and about the night that almost ended everything. Part 2, The Gathering Storm. December came, cold and clear, with temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. My passage proved itself again and again. I walked from cabin to workshop a dozen times a day, never once stepping into the bitter wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. My firewood stayed dry in the workshop. My food supplies stayed accessible. My life continued even as the valley froze around me. Others began to take notice. "Maybe we should build one of those," I overheard Opal Hendricks say to her husband at the general store. "Between the boarding house and the stable. It would make the winter chores much easier." Her husband laughed. "Learn carpentry from a 14-year-old girl," he said. I would rather freeze, but I saw the way he looked at my passage when he thought no one was watching. I saw the calculations in his eyes, the grudging respect he was too proud to admit. Silas Thornton said nothing at all after that first storm, which worried me more than his insults ever had. On the night of December 8th, Britta came to my door in tears. It was past midnight, and the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. She was wearing only her nightgown and a thin shawl, her feet bare on the frozen ground, her lips already turning blue. I pulled her inside and wrapped her in every blanket I had. "What happened?" I demanded. "Why are you out in this cold?" "I had a nightmare," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "About my mother. I dreamed I saw her in the snow, reaching for me, calling my name. I ran outside to find her, but she was not there. She is never there." I held her while she cried. This girl who had become my friend, my ally, my sister in everything but blood. I held her and stroked her hair and told her everything would be all right, even though I did not know if it was true. Queenie jumped onto the bed and pressed herself against Britta's chest, purring loudly, offering warmth and comfort. "You are frozen," I said when Britta's sobs finally quieted. "We need to warm you up." I built up the fire and made hot tea with extra honey and piled quilts on top of her until she looked like a small mountain of fabric. Slowly, the color returned to her face. But the damage was done. By morning, she was burning with fever. Gunnar came as soon as I sent word, his face gray with fear. The doctor was away, called to a difficult birth on the other side of the valley. There was no one to help. "It is her lungs," Gunnar said, and I heard the terror in his voice, just like her mother. Maren always had weak lungs. She caught cold easily and never recovered quickly. I always worried Britta had inherited that. Britta was delirious with fever, calling for her mother, reaching for something only she could see. I remembered my grandmother's final weeks, the cough that never stopped, the fever that burned and burned, the slow, terrible surrender to something that could not be fought. I would not let that happen to Britta. I sent Gunnar home to care for his other children. Someone had to watch them, and I could not leave Britta alone. I sat by her bed for 3 days and 3 nights. I bathed her forehead with cool water. I made her drink tea with honey and herbs my grandmother had taught me to use. I prayed to a God I was not sure I believed in. And Queenie never left Britta's side. The cat curled up on her chest, a warm weight that rose and fell with each labored breath. She purred constantly, a rumbling sound that seemed to fill the room, a vibration I could feel through the bed frame. On the 3rd night, when the fever was at its worst, Britta stopped breathing. I did not realize it at first. The room was quiet, so quiet, and I was dozing in my chair, exhausted from days without real sleep. Then Queenie screamed. It was not a meow. It was not a hiss. It was a sound I had never heard a cat make, a high piercing shriek that snapped me awake instantly. Britta was not moving. Her chest was still. Her face was turning blue. I grabbed her shoulders and shook her, calling her name, begging her to wake up. Nothing. Then Queenie did something I will never forget as long as I live. She stood up on Britta's chest and began pressing down with her front paws over and over in a steady rhythm, pressing and releasing, like she was trying to force the life back into Britta's body. I did not know what she was doing. I did not know if it could possibly work. But I followed her lead, pressing on Britta's chest, trying to force air into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Britta gasped. She coughed, a terrible wet sound, and then she was breathing again, harsh and ragged, but breathing. Queenie lay back down on her chest and resumed purring, as if nothing unusual had happened. I collapsed into my chair and sobbed with relief. The fever broke the next morning. Britta opened her eyes, looked at me, looked at Queenie, and smiled weakly. "I had the strangest dream," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was drowning in snow, and then a cat made of fire came and pulled me out." I looked at Queenie, who was calmly grooming her whiskers as if saving lives was just another part of her daily routine. "That was no dream," I said. "That was Queenie. She saved your life." Britta reached out with a trembling hand and stroked the cat's fur. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not letting me go to my mother yet." Queenie purred and closed her eyes, accepting the gratitude as her due. Gunnar came that afternoon, bringing food and firewood, and tears he tried unsuccessfully to hide. When I told him what had happened, about the breathing stopping and Queenie's intervention, he knelt down and looked the cat directly in her golden eyes. "You are more than just a cat," he said solemnly. "I do not know what you are, but you are something special." Queenie blinked slowly, the cat equivalent of a smile. She's been protecting this family since the day she arrived, I said. My grandmother always said Queenie was sent to watch over us. Gunnar stood up and looked at me. His expression changed. I used to think you were foolish, he said, building your passage, talking about saving lives, believing in impossible things. I thought grief had clouded your judgment. He paused. But I was wrong, he continued. You are not foolish. You are brave. And you are surrounded by things that protect you. Your grandmother's love, your grandfather's dreams, and now this remarkable cat. He put his hand on my shoulder. Teach me, he said. Teach me to build a passage between my house and my barn. I will not lose another person I love because I was too proud to learn from someone younger than my own daughter. I nodded, too moved to speak. December passed in a blur of work and recovery. Britta regained her strength slowly, staying with me until she was well enough to go home. During those weeks, she became more than a friend. She became the sister I had never had. We talked about everything. Our mothers, both lost too soon. Our fathers, both broken in their own ways. Our fears for the future. Our hopes for what might come. What will you do when you grow up? Britta asked me one night as we sat by the fire with Queenie between us. I thought about it. I want to build more passages, I said. I want to teach people how to connect their buildings, how to survive the winter without risking their lives every time they step outside. I want to make sure no one ever freezes to death walking 30 feet from their barn to their house. Britta nodded. That is a good dream, she said. What about you? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. I want to remember my mother without crying, she said finally. I want to stop having nightmares about finding her in the snow. I took her hand. You will, I said. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but someday. The happy memories will be stronger than the sad ones. How do you know? She asked. Because I lost my mother too, I said, and my father, and my grandmother. And I can think about them now without falling apart. It took time, but it happened. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I am glad I have you, Sina, she said. I am glad I have you too, I whispered back. Queenie purred between us, warm and content. On the morning of December 17th, the sky changed. I noticed it first thing when I stepped outside to check on my chickens. There was something wrong with the light, a strange quality to it that made my skin prickle. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight, and the barometric pressure was dropping. I could feel it in my bones, in the ache of my joints, in the way my breathing felt slightly wrong. Gunnar noticed it too. He came to my cabin before noon, his face pale. Do you feel it? He asked. I nodded. He looked at the sky nearby, at the clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with snow. This is how it felt, he said quietly. The day Marin died. The air felt exactly like this, heavy, wrong, like the whole world was holding its breath before something terrible. I remembered my grandmother talking about the Great White Death, the blizzard of 1888 that killed hundreds of people across the Northern Territories. She had survived it only because she happened to be inside when it started and stayed there for 4 days, rationing food and burning furniture to stay warm. This feels like that, she had told me once. When a storm that size is coming, you can feel it in your blood. The animals know, the trees know, and if you pay attention, you can know too. I was paying attention now. Go home, I told Gunnar. Get your children. Bring them here. He stared at me. Here, he said. Why here? Because my cabin is stronger, I said. Because I have the passage connecting to the workshop. And the workshop has the forge that burns hotter than any fireplace. Because I have firewood stacked to the roof and food preserved for months. Because if this storm is as bad as I think it is, we are going to need every advantage we can get. He hesitated for only a moment. Then he ran. The snow began to fall at 3 in the afternoon. Light at first, just a few flakes drifting down from a gray sky. But within an hour, the wind had risen to a howl, and the flakes had become a wall of white so thick I could not see my own fence, just 30 feet away. Gunnar arrived with his 4 children just as the storm hit its full force. We barely made it, he gasped, carrying his youngest son in his arms. The wind nearly knocked us off our feet twice. I have never seen a blizzard come on so fast. We got everyone inside. We lit every lamp, stoked every fire, gathered blankets and food and water, preparing to wait out whatever was coming. and still the storm grew stronger. By nightfall, the wind was screaming like a living thing, a monster made of cold and fury throwing itself against my walls. The whole cabin shook with each gust. Snow piled against the windows, blocking the light, cutting us off from the world outside. "We are going to die," whimpered Gunner's youngest daughter, just 6 years old. "We are going to freeze like Mama." "No," said Britta, wrapping her arms around her sister. "No, we are not. Sina built us a passage. We are safe here." I looked at my passage through the window, barely visible in the swirling white. I hoped she was right. This is the moment I need to pause. This is where everything changed, where my life and the lives of everyone in that cabin hung in the balance. If you have stayed with me this long, if you have felt what I felt, feared what I feared, hoped what I hoped, then I want to ask you something. Have you ever faced a storm you did not think you could survive? Have you ever been trapped, afraid, wondering if you would see the morning? Hit that like button if you believe I made it through. Subscribe if you want to know how 16 people survived what came next. And leave me a comment telling me what you would do, trapped in a tiny cabin with a blizzard raging outside and 5 days of cold still to come. Now let me tell you what happened when the town came to my door. Part 3. 5 days of white death. The first day was the hardest. Not because of the cold, though that was brutal. Not because of the wind, though it never stopped screaming. The first day was hard because of the not knowing. How long would the storm last? How bad would it get? Did we have enough food, enough firewood, enough hope to survive? I did not have answers to any of those questions, but I had my passage. On that first morning, while Gunnar and his children huddled by the fire, I walked through it alone, just to see, just to prove to myself that it was still there. The walls rattled with each gust, but they did not break. The snow pressed against the slatted sides, filling the gaps between boards. But the design worked exactly as my grandfather had planned. The overlapping boards blocked most of the snow, while the gaps prevented pressure from building up and tearing the structure apart. The floor was dry. The air inside was cold but still, untouched by the chaos raging just inches away. When I reached the workshop, I stood there for a long moment, surrounded by my tools and my firewood and my grandmother's old forge. And I wept with relief. It worked. Even in this storm, perhaps the worst storm I had ever seen, my passage worked. On the second day, the pounding started. At first, I thought it was just the wind throwing something against the cabin. A branch maybe, or a piece of debris torn loose from somewhere. But then I heard a voice. "Help!" someone screamed. "Please, for the love of God, help us!" I ran to the door and threw it open. Opal Hendricks fell into my arms, covered in snow from head to toe, barely conscious. Behind her, struggling through the blizzard, were her husband and their 3 grown children. "The boarding house," Opal gasped, her voice raw from screaming into the wind. The roof collapsed. The whole second floor came down. We had nowhere to go. We saw smoke from your chimney. "Get inside," I said, "all of you, quickly." Before you freeze, they stumbled in, bringing the cold with them, bringing the fear. Now there were 11 of us in a cabin built for one. We made room. We shared blankets. We rationed food that suddenly seemed much less plentiful. And we waited. On the third day, old Lars Svensson arrived. He was 75 years old, half blind from cataracts, and had somehow made it from his farm 2 miles away by following the fence lines with his bare hands, feeling his way through the blizzard post by post. He collapsed at my door, more dead than alive. His fingers were black with frostbite. His face was white as the snow that covered him. He could barely speak. "Could not stay," he whispered as we carried him inside. Barn collapsed. Animals all dead. Nothing left for me there. I gave him my bed. I wrapped him in every blanket I could find. I gave him the last of my medicinal whiskey to warm his blood. He slept for 16 hours straight. When he finally woke, he looked around at all the people crowded into my small cabin, and he smiled. "Always knew you were something special," he said to me. "Your grandmother told me, years ago, said you would do something nobody else could do, said you would save this valley someday." I did not know what to say. "She was right," he said. "She was always right about everything." On the 4th day, the Morrison family arrived. They had seen the smoke from my chimney, the only sign of life in a valley that had become a white desert of death. They had walked for 3 hours through snow that came up to their chests, carrying their 2 children, praying with every step that they would not collapse before they reached shelter. There were 4 of them, a mother named Ruth, a father named James, a boy of 10, and a girl of 8. We fit them in somehow. 16 people now, 16 souls crammed into 2 small cabins connected by a passage that everyone had said would fail. That night, as the storm raged outside, I walked through the passage to my workshop and stood there in the darkness. I could hear the wind screaming. I could feel the walls shudder with each gust. I could sense the cold pressing in from all sides, hungry and patient, waiting for any weakness it could exploit. But the passage held. We rationed every bite of food, every drop of water, every stick of firewood. We told stories to keep our spirits up. Old tales of other storms survived, other hardships overcome. And Queenie moved among us like a small, furry angel. She would curl up with whoever seemed to need comfort most. The children buried their faces in her fur when they were scared. The old folks stroked her back when the waiting became unbearable. Even Opal Hendricks, who had always claimed to hate cats, held Queenie in her lap for hours, drawing strength from her steady purr. She was the heart of our little refuge, the calm in the center of the storm. On the 5th day, just before dawn, someone pounded on my door. The storm was finally beginning to weaken. The wind had died down from a scream to a moan. The snow was still falling, but lighter now, less desperate. I thought we were past the worst of it. I thought we had survived. Then I heard the pounding. I opened the door and found myself face to face with Silas Thornton. He was barely recognizable. His face was white with frostbite, patches of dead skin already forming on his cheeks and nose. His lips were blue as a summer sky. His hands were frozen into claws, unable to grip anything, unable to even knock properly. He fell forward, and I caught him. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracked and broken. "Please," I stood there, holding the man who had tried to destroy me. The man who had sabotaged my posts. The man who had threatened to take my land. The man who had laughed when I said my passage would save lives. The man who might have had something to do with my parents' death. Now he was dying, and I was his only hope. Behind me, I heard Gunner's voice. "Leave him," he said coldly. "After everything he did to you, after the posts he destroyed, the lies he spread, the threats he made, leave him to the cold he loves so much." I looked at Silas Thornton, at this broken man in my arms. I thought about the posts he had knocked down. I thought about the meeting where he had tried to have me declared incompetent. I thought about every cruel word, every mocking smile, every attempt to drive me off my land. I thought about my parents dying on a mountain road while he rode past without stopping. And then I thought about my grandmother. What would she do? I already knew the answer. "Help me get him inside," I said. Gunner stared at me. "Cena," he said, "this man tried to ruin you." "I know," I said, "but no one dies on my doorstep if I can prevent it. Not even him." I dragged Silas Thornton into my cabin and laid him by the fire. And I saved the life of my enemy. When Silas woke, hours later, the storm had finally stopped. The silence was almost shocking after 5 days of constant wind. The world outside was white and still, buried under feet of snow, transformed into something unrecognizable. Silas looked around at the people crowded into my cabin. 16 strangers, all staring at him with varying degrees of hostility. He looked at the passage through the window, still standing, still intact. He looked at me, and then, for the first time since I had known him, Silas Thornton began to cry. "I destroyed your posts," he said, his voice breaking. "I cut the ropes in the middle of the night and pushed them over. I wanted you to fail. I wanted you to give up and sell me your land." "I know," I said. "I told everyone you were crazy," he continued. "I laughed at your dreams. I tried to have you declared incompetent so I could take everything you had." "I know that too," I said. He was sobbing now, ugly, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. "Why did you save me?" he asked. "After everything I did, why did you not just leave me to die?" I was quiet for a moment. "Because letting you die would not bring my posts back," I said finally. "Because my grandmother taught me that revenge is a poison that kills the person who drinks it. Because I want to be able to live with myself when this is all over. I paused. And because no one deserves to die alone in the snow, I added, not even you. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I never expected. Your parents, he whispered. The accident. I was there. The room went silent. Everyone was listening now. I saw their wagon go off the road, Silas said. I was riding by, just a few hundred yards away. I saw them crash. I could have helped. I could have ridden down and pulled them out. He paused. But I was angry, he continued, at your mother for rejecting me 20 years before, at your father for taking her away. So I kept writing. I told myself they would be fine. I told myself someone else would help them. His voice cracked. By the time I came back, hours later, it was too late, he finished. They were both frozen. Your father was holding your mother, trying to keep her warm. He died trying to save her. I felt the blood drain from my face. 11 years, I whispered. You knew for 11 years and you said nothing. I was ashamed, he said. I have been ashamed every day since, but I was too much of a coward to admit it. I told myself it was not my fault, that they would have died anyway, that nothing I could have done would have made a difference. He looked at me with eyes full of something I had never seen in him before. Guilt. I was wrong, he said, about everything. And I am sorry. I know that does not help. I know it does not bring them back. But I am sorry. I stood there looking at this man who had shaped so much of my life without me ever knowing it. This man who had let my parents die. This man who had spent years trying to take what was theirs, what was mine. This man who was now broken and crying and begging for forgiveness. I did not know if I could give. The room was completely silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what I would do. I took a deep breath. You will have to live with what you did, I said finally. Every day for the rest of your life, every time you see me, every time you pass my land, you will remember what you could have done differently. I paused. That is punishment enough, I said. I am not going to add to it by hating you. Hate takes too much energy, and I have better things to do with my life. I turned away from him. But I want you to remember something, Silas Thornton, I added. I want you to remember that when you needed help, I gave it to you. When you were dying on my doorstep, I pulled you inside. I did not leave you to freeze the way you left my parents. I met his eyes one last time. That is the difference between us, I said, and that is all I have to say. Let me pause here for just a moment. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had to forgive someone who hurt you deeply? Have you ever had to choose between holding on to anger and letting it go? I made my choice that day. I chose to let go, not because Silas Thornton deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved to be free of the burden of hating him. What would you have done? Leave me a comment and tell me. Tell me about the times you had to forgive someone who did not deserve it. Tell me about the grace you found in yourself when you did not expect it. And now, let me tell you how the story ends. The storm broke on December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, giving way to the promise of lengthening days. I was the first one out. I walked through my passage for what felt like the 100th time, descended the snow-buried steps at the workshop end, and stepped into a transformed world. The valley was unrecognizable. Snow had drifted 15 feet high in some places, burying fences, covering first-floor windows, reshaping the landscape into something alien and strange. Several buildings had collapsed under the weight. I could see the ruins of the boarding house from where I stood. The church steeple had snapped off and lay half buried in a drift. 3 farmhouses on the far side of the valley were nothing but piles of timber and snow. But my passage stood. The peaked roof had shed the snow exactly as my grandfather designed. The elevated floor had kept the walkway above the worst drifts. The slatted walls had flexed with the wind instead of fighting it, bending but never breaking. It had survived. Dear God, Gunnar breathed, coming up behind me. Signa, you did it. You actually did it. I did not do it alone, I said, but I was smiling when I said it. The days after the storm were hard. The sun came out, bright and merciless, making the snow glitter like a field of diamonds. It was beautiful, achingly beautiful, but that beauty hid a terrible truth. Beneath that pristine white blanket lay the wreckage of our community. We learned that 9 people had died. 9 souls who could not reach shelter, could not find protection, could not survive the 5 days of killing cold. Among them was the old school teacher who had taught me to read. Miss Abigail, we called her. She had given me my first book, a worn copy of fairy tales that I still kept by my bed. She died trying to reach her sister's house, less than a quarter of a mile away. Among them was a baby girl, just 3 months old, whose family had tried to wait out the storm in a cabin that was not strong enough. The roof collapsed on the third day. The parents survived. The baby did not. We mourned them. We held a memorial service in the ruins of the church, standing in the snow because there was no building large enough to hold everyone. We spoke their names, we shared our memories. We wept for what we had lost. But we also celebrated the living. 16 people had survived because of my passage. 16 souls who would have frozen if I had not built something everyone said was impossible. 16 families who would have empty chairs at their tables, but instead had everyone they loved gathered close. That was worth something. That was worth everything. And when the valley gathered to count the losses and plan for the future, Silas Thornton stood up. "I have something to say," he announced. Everyone fell silent. Everyone knew what he had done, how he had treated me, the cruelty he had shown. They expected another attack, another attempt to take my land. But that was not what came. "I was wrong," Silas said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "About everything, about Sina Lindgren, about her passage, about what kind of person she is." He turned to face me. "I sabotaged her work. I tried to steal her land. I let her parents die when I could have saved them. And when I was freezing to death on her doorstep, she saved my life anyway." He paused. "That is grace," he said quietly. "That is mercy. That is something I do not deserve and cannot repay." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This is the deed to 20 acres of my land," he said. "The 20 acres that border her property to the south, including the water rights to Willow Creek. I am signing it over to her, free and clear, as partial payment for a debt I can never fully repay." He held it out to me. I stared at it. "I do not want your land," I said. "Take it anyway," he said, "and teach me to build a passage of my own. What you created saved 16 lives in one storm. It could save hundreds more in the years to come." I looked at the document in his hand. I looked at the people gathered around me. The people who had doubted me, mocked me, told me I was a fool. Now they were looking at me with something very close to respect. I took the deed. Epilogue, the legacy. Spring came slowly to Coal Valley that year. The snow melted inch by inch, revealing a landscape scarred by the storm. Collapsed buildings, broken fences, the wreckage of lives that would take years to rebuild, but also something new. As the weather warmed, I began to teach. Everyone who wanted to learn came to my cabin. Gunnar and his children, the Hendricks family, the Morrisons, even Silas Thornton, who proved to be a surprisingly attentive student. I showed them my grandfather's drawings. I explained the principles behind the design. I taught them to calculate loads and angles, to sink posts deep enough to resist frost, to build roofs that would shed snow instead of collecting it. By summer, 3 families had started construction on their own passages. By fall, 7 more had begun. And by the following winter, when the storms came again, 16 buildings in Coal Valley were connected by covered walkways. No one froze to death that year, or the year after that, or the year after that. The design spread beyond our valley. Traders carried word of it to other towns. Newspapers picked up the story. The girl who built bridges through winter, they called me. The orphan who saved her enemies. I did not like the fame. I did not want to be famous. I just wanted to help people survive. But the attention brought benefits I could not ignore. Engineers came from back east to study my designs. They took my grandfather's principles and improved on them, creating stronger structures, more efficient layouts, better ways to shed snow and resist wind. Within 10 years, what we called Lindgren passages were standard in dozens of mountain towns across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Within 20 years, the technique had spread to Canada, Alaska, and parts of Scandinavia, where builders recognized the old world wisdom in designs that had originated in the frozen valleys of Sweden. My grandfather's dream, born in the old country, carried across the ocean by a stubborn immigrant, refined by his granddaughter in the killing cold of Montana, had finally come true. Britta and I remained close through all of it. We grew up together, two girls who had lost their mothers finding in each other the sisterhood they had never had. We shared secrets and dreams and fears. We argued like sisters argue over silly things that seemed important at the time, and we always made up before the sun set. We watched each other grow from frightened children into confident women. When I married a young engineer from Boston who came to study my passages and stayed for love, Britta stood beside me at the altar. She cried more than I did, happy tears streaming down her face as she watched me say my vows. When she married a carpenter who helped build the first passage in the neighboring valley, I stood beside her. I cried too. We both laughed about it afterward, two grown women weeping like babies at each other's weddings. We raised our children together, our families living in houses connected by passages, never more than 30 steps apart. Our children grew up as cousins, playing together in the passages we had built, never understanding why adults made such a fuss about walking between buildings. To them, it was just the way things were. She saved my life, I told my children when they were old enough to understand. When I was so alone I thought I would die of it, Britta believed in me. She was my first true friend, and she has been my best friend ever since. And Queenie saved mine, Britta told her own children. When I stopped breathing in the night, that old cat pressed on my chest until I started again. She was more than a pet. She was a guardian angel with fur and whiskers. Queenie lived until 1900, 12 years old, and still supervising everything from her favorite windowsill. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep, I buried her at the entrance to my original passage. Her gravestone was simple. Queenie, she believed first, 1888 to 1900. The whole valley came to her burial. Not because she was just a cat, but because she represented something important. The loyalty that sustains us when everyone else has given up. The faith that someone we love is doing something worthwhile even when we cannot understand it. I lived a long life. I saw Cold Valley grow from a handful of stubborn settlers to a thriving community of hundreds. I saw my passages become standard practice across the Northern Territories. I saw my children and grandchildren learn to build the way I had taught them. And on winter nights, when the storms came and the snow buried everything, and the cold tried to kill anyone foolish enough to venture outside, I would walk through my passage, the same passage I had built when I was 14 years old, and remember. I remembered my grandmother, who believed in me when no one else did. I remembered my grandfather, who dreamed of bridges through winter and never got to build them. I remembered Queenie, who saved lives with nothing but warmth and stubbornness. I remembered Britta, who became my sister. I remembered Gunnar, who learned to hope again. I even remembered Silas Thornton, who learned too late that cruelty is its own punishment. I died in 1954, 75 years old, in the cabin my great-grandfather had built. More than 300 people came to my funeral. Families who had survived blizzards because of passages I taught them to build. Children and grandchildren of the 16 refugees who had sheltered in my workshop during the Great Storm of 1893. Strangers who had never met me but had read about my designs and built their own versions. My granddaughter read the eulogy. My grandmother was 14 years old when she started building. She said, everyone called her crazy. Everyone said a girl could not do something so ambitious. Everyone told her to sell her land and leave. She paused. She built it anyway, she continued. And when the worst storm in Montana history tried to kill this valley, her passage was the only thing standing. Her design saved 16 people in one storm. Her teaching saved thousands in the decades after. My granddaughter placed her hand on my casket. The passages she designed still stand, she said. They still save lives every winter. And every time someone walks from building to building without stepping into the killing cold, they are honoring my grandmother's memory. She stepped back. Rest now, grandmother, she said. Queenie is waiting, and the bridges will hold. The original passage still stands today. The cabins have been rebuilt twice, modernized with electricity and insulation and all the comforts of the modern age. But the elevated walkway is original, the same posts I sank in 1893, the same floor I walked across during the Great Blizzard, the same peaked roof that shed snow while the valley buried itself in white. Visitors come sometimes to see where it all began, to stand in the passage where 16 people survived the worst storm in memory, to touch the wood that a 14-year-old orphan girl cut and shaped and fitted, while her neighbors called her a fool. At the entrance stands a memorial with 3 markers, weathered by time but still standing strong after all these years. Signe Lindgren, 1879 to 1954. She built bridges when others built walls. Britta Eriksson Lindgren, 1880 to 1956. She believed when others doubted. Queenie, 1888 to 1900. She chose wisely. Flowers appear at the base of these markers every spring, left by visitors who never knew us but who felt connected to our story. Sometimes there are notes tucked between the stones, messages of thanks from families whose ancestors survived because of what I built, messages of hope from young people who read our story and found the courage to pursue their own impossible dreams. Every winter when the storms come and the snow buries the valley and the temperature drops toward lethal, people walk through covered passages between their buildings and arrive safely at their destinations. Children go to school, families visit each other, the elderly check on their neighbors. No one freezes between structures that are only 30 feet apart. That was the promise I made when I started digging post holes at 14 years old. That is the promise the passages keep every single day, in every storm, for every family that walks safely from home to barn and back again. And now, my friend, I have one last thing to say to you. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to my story, for feeling what I felt, for believing in a 14-year-old girl who refused to give up when the whole world told her she should. This story is more than just history. It is a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. It is proof that one person, with enough determination and the right dream, can change the world. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel. We share stories like this one every week. Stories about hope in the darkest times. Stories about second chances when all seems lost. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when everyone told them it was impossible. Leave me a comment and tell me what this story meant to you. Tell me about the passages you have built in your own life, the bridges between isolation and connection, the choices between giving up and pressing on, the moments when you had to believe in yourself because no one else would. Have you ever been told your dreams were impossible? Have you ever proved them wrong? I want to hear your story. Until next time, remember what I learned in that frozen valley so many years ago. Winter is not a death sentence. It is just a problem waiting for a solution. Build your passage, believe in yourself, and never, ever let anyone tell you what you cannot do.